thank you, Suzanne, for the very kind introduction. I hadn't realised quite how distinguished the list of previous Cameron Award speakers were, so the pressure's really on now, so thank you very much. I must say that I guess like many student journalists in the audience today, I grew up wanting to be a journalist, and I even knew what sort of a journalist I wanted to be, which was a foreign correspondent. And sitting on the shelves of my parents' house was a book called Point of Departure, which was the memoirs of a man who was the great foreign correspondent of his day, James Cameron. The book's dust jacket referred to him as probably the most experienced and certainly the most widely travelled writer in the world. Cameron was a one-off. He wrote in his own voice, and he saw things his own way. He, I think, fulfilled the ambition of George Orwell, who wrote that he wanted to turn political writing into an art. And most journalism is ephemeral. It's not even really meant to last. Yet, decades after I first picked up Point of Departure, I can still open it up and be swept away by Cameron's chapter on witnessing the atomic bomb test in Bikini Atoll in 1946. His account captures both the sinister and the ludicrous nature of the event. His writing's deceptively languid, but it manages to wind up the tension. And like many great journalistic observers, he has an eye for the sinister or poignant detail. In this case, the unsuspecting animals tethered to the boats that were about to be incinerated by an atomic bomb. Cameron wrote, "Down on the boat deck waited the little company of flesh and blood, standing reflectively in pens for their most abrupt and instructive dissolution. There were a few goats with pale and cynical eyes, one or two brown-spotted pigs. A scientist beside me said, 'I feel a little like apologizing to those pigs. They belong to a reasonable and complicated people, not without a certain grace. At least,' he said, 'they aren't crazy.'" The photo on the back of the book shows, back of Point of Departure, portrays Cameron as a mixture of a literary figure and a world traveller. It shows a quizzical-looking man in a jacket and tie with a cigarette in his hand. There is no glass of scotch in the photo, but I mentally supplied one looking at it. By the Vietnam era, there was a new generation of glamorous foreign correspondents who were a bit more rock and roll than James Cameron. Michael Herr's dispatches placed the hard-living writers and photographers covering the Vietnam War right at the center of the narrative. And it was a book that caught my imagination and that of many other school kids who were dreaming of one day being a foreign correspondent. By the early 1980s, I was at university and made a trip to Israel during the 1982 Lebanon War. And there I actually met some real foreign correspondents. At a party in Jerusalem, which I still remember to this day, I had a long conversation with David Blundy of the Sunday Times, who was like a foreign correspondent out of central casting. He was good-looking, funny, extroverted, just back from the front line. And he was also generous enough to have a long conversation with me, who was a student at the time. And I remember actually discussing Michael Herr's dispatches with David, and David remarking that he wasn't totally comfortable with the way that Herr had made the journalists the heroes of the book and the center of the narrative. A few years later, I was lucky enough to be David Blundy's colleague. He was the Washington bureau chief for a new newspaper, the Sunday Correspondent, and I was working alongside him as a freelance and as his deputy in the Washington office. But the story does not have a happy ending. David always found Washington a bit dull, and one week, just a couple of months after the paper was launched, he decided to go down to El Salvador to cover the war there. And just a few hours after arriving, he went to report on the fighting, and he was shot and killed by a sniper. David's death serves as a reminder, if one were needed, that being a foreign correspondent can also be a dangerous and deadly business. And we have a further reminder that Ian Pannell has just gone off to cover a war and today, which is going on now. Now, of course, many foreign postings are not remotely dangerous. I spent 5 very happy years in Brussels, which is not, I think, a posting that David Blundy would particularly have enjoyed, although it was one that I genuinely found fascinating. But it is also true that many of the most dramatic and important foreign stories involve wars and involve fighting, and they're risky to cover. James Cameron covered the Korean and Vietnam Wars. David Blundy had covered conflicts all over the world. And many years after his death, one of his close friends from the Sunday Times years, Marie Colvin, was also killed covering the war in Syria. Now, the kinds of foreign correspondents who cover war zones often develop their own strange sense of what risks they are and they aren't willing to take. This was brought home to me a few years ago on a trip with a group of journalists to Afghanistan. And included in our group was the excellent Jason Burke of The Guardian and Observer, who covers so many wars that rather intimidatingly he arrived with his own flak jacket, which was tailor-made. Yeah, I can still remember Jason's shock when I served myself food from the buffet at the Hotel Serena in Kabul. And he turned to me and said, "Do you know how long that food will have been sitting there?" He said, "Do you know how dangerous it is to eat it?" So I thanked him for alerting me to the dangers of the plate of chicken biryani in front of me. But I also tried to argue to him that it was probably more dangerous to spend a couple of weeks embedded with NATO troops in Helmand province, which was what Jason was proposing to do and indeed went about doing. So a lot of foreign correspondents, as well as being very entertaining people, are quite peculiar and sort of singular people. Covering wars, however, is not just dangerous, but it is also expensive. And certainly if you try to take the right precautions. Which brings me to the central topic of the talk tonight, which is the future of the foreign correspondent. In particular, there are three challenges that I want to discuss. The first is the near collapse of the business model of much of the Western media and the threat that they'll be unable to continue to fund foreign reporting in the way that they once did. The second is the rise in social media and what that means for how news is reported and the traditional authority of the foreign correspondent. And the third is the rise of state-sponsored non-Western media and the challenge they pose to the narratives and priorities of the traditional Western media organizations. When it comes to money, it should be noted that journalists have always feared that the great editorial money pot was about to empty. And they've always lamented the good old days when expenses were no object. And writing in 1967, James Cameron recalled his first days as a foreign correspondent after the war. And he wrote, "I went to India, China, South America. I crept around post-war Europe. I went to Siam and Burma and Indonesia and the Caribbean and to eccentric and even pretentious places like Patagonia and Afghanistan and even Tibet. I went to everywhere in the world. And half the time, such was the permissive journalistic climate of the time, mainly for the simple purpose of going and not for any end product. I cannot think of any trade or calling that would have accorded a fairly young and earnest person like myself the same extravagant resources to examine the planet." Cameron was right. And yet, I can give you a similar lament about the lost extravagance of just 25 years ago. As The Economist Southeast Asia correspondent in 1992, I was astonished and delighted to inherit a penthouse flat, a cook, a driver, and The Economist's arrangements were not notably extravagant. The American newspapers seemed to have even more money to burn. I remember the LA Times correspondent in Singapore telling me that it was actually written into his contract that he and his family would always fly everywhere first class. And he described to me the satisfaction of seeing the businessman recoil when he entered the first-class cabin with his 2-year-old son in tow. Well, there was my friend from the New York Times who I encountered at the Shangri-La Hotel in Manila, the best hotel in town, of course. He'd stayed there for several weeks, waiting for New York to publish his story on the Philippines. And he told me that it's New York Times policy, or it was, that if a story was datelined Manila, the author had to be physically in the city when it was published. So Phil was just going to stay at the Shangri-La Hotel, migrating moodily from the outdoor pool to the indoor gymnasium until such time as the editors in New York saw fit to publish his story. As James Cameron wrote in 1967, it wouldn't happen now. And actually, it really wouldn't. The internet has had a pretty catastrophic impact on the finances of the traditional news publishers and the network of foreign correspondents which they supported. All those first-class tickets, stays at the Shangri-La, were financed by the deluge of classified ads that made papers like the New York Times and the LA Times rich. And the classifieds have all migrated to the internet, and now display advertising, I think particularly actually this year, is also moving increasingly to Google and Facebook, which claim, and probably do, offer a much better targeted audience. So as hard-pressed newspapers and broadcasters look for money to save, their eyes fall increasingly on foreign bureaus. Even if the correspondents no longer live in penthouse flats and have dispensed with the driver, foreign bureaus are still expensive to run. And worse, the ability to count clicks on stories has demonstrated to publishers that foreign stories are just not read very much. So why spend money supporting the most expensive part of the operation when you know that a cat video or a story on Kim Kardashian will attract far more attention? The decrease in the amount of foreign coverage that traditional news outlets are willing or able to afford is a common problem across the Western world. I was recently reading a lecture on Australian soft power. I do read some quite odd things in my job. And the author, Michael Fuller-Love, who's the head of a big think tank, was complaining there that even as events in the outside world matter more and more to ordinary Australians, as tensions mount in Asia and so on, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is slashing its foreign coverage. And yet, the picture is not unremittingly bleak, and in fact, it does need qualifying. If I look at my own three main employers in my career, which are the BBC, The Economist, and the FT, it's certainly true that money is much tighter than it once was. And yet, all three organizations continue to maintain formidable networks of foreign correspondents. In fact, I would say the Economist network is still considerably more expensive and extensive now than it was when I joined in 1990. So they know that, as does the FT, that reporting the world is a crucial part of their identities. And all three of those organizations, the FT, the Economist, the BBC, will do our utmost not to let that slip. It's part of who we are. Now, I know the picture is less encouraging at some other publications and broadcasters. The Daily Telegraph, for example, used to have a superb network of foreign correspondents, many of whom have now left or seen their bureaus closed, some of whom have actually ended up at the FT. The big American regional newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, slashed foreign coverage a long time ago. And yet, there are also new media organizations that are popping up to fill their places. So the FT recently hired a new correspondent into our Moscow bureau, and we have 3 in Moscow alone. And the correspondent was from BuzzFeed. So 20 years ago, the feeder organization would have been much more likely to have been Reuters. Globalization's also spawned a much greater appetite for international business news. Bloomberg was an organization which didn't exist when I started out, and it's now a huge global news organization with well-staffed offices all over the world. And while it is true that their bread and butter is business coverage, they do also cover politics. They have offices in Washington, D.C., in Beijing, and so on, and foreign policy and on the side, and it's the business coverage that funds that. And the shrinkage of the budgets of the traditional news organizations also opens up opportunities for freelancers. This has always been a traditional way into the profession, particularly for the young. In fact, my first stint as a foreign correspondent involved leaving the staff of the BBC and going freelance for a couple of years in Washington. As staff jobs shrink, so freelance opportunities open up. Newspapers that might once have supported a foreign correspondent or a bureau in a foreign capital will now be delighted if they can find a reliable or creative freelance. And new technologies are making it easier for young freelancers. You no longer need a camera crew to film a report. I'm told you can do it on an iPhone, although I've never attempted it myself. And of course, there's a plethora of simple ways of sending your story over by email, text, WhatsApp, whatever. This may seem hardly worth noting for most of you in the audience, and yet it still seems both miraculous and faintly baffling to me. When I started reporting from abroad, the business of filing was still a real nightmare. One of the first things you were taught as a trainee radio correspondent at the BBC in the 1980s was how to dismantle a hotel telephone and then hopefully put it back together again so you didn't get stuck with a bill. And what you had to do was take off the mouthpiece, you then attached crocodile clips to the mouthpiece, then you kind of stuck a microphone in somehow, then you filed through the microphone. In fact, the sheer palaver of all that was one of the things that motivated me to switch to print. But even there, things were still amazingly primitive. I mentioned my job with the Sunday Correspondent in Washington in 1989, and filing by computer was just coming in. But in the 3 months that David Blundy and I worked together, we never did manage to get the modem on our joint computer working, despite innumerable visits from some long-forgotten company. Instead, more often than not, we ended up reading our copy down the phone to London. So the combination of new technology and the financial problems of old media do provide an opening for today's freelance foreign correspondents. There are also, however, issues of ethics and safety involved. At the Financial Times, we know that there are brave young journalists who will risk their lives trying to report from places like Syria. But we have to ask whether we can morally encourage them to take those risks when they won't be able to take the safety precautions that we would insist on for one of our own correspondents if they were going into a war zone. In extreme situations such as Syria, for the FT, the answer is usually no, we can't do that. Social media and technology also affects not just the way that stories can be created and filed, but more importantly, perhaps, or just as importantly, they affect the way that stories are consumed. Conventional newspapers like mine are increasingly finding that their stories and reporting are being followed not by people who buy the newspaper directly or subscribe to it online, but through social media. So if people read a column of mine, for example, more than 50% of readers now will have likely to have come across it indirectly because it's been tweeted or because somebody's posted it on Facebook. In most respects, the way that people get to read your story shouldn't affect the fundamental job as a foreign correspondent or commentator. The important thing, obviously, is simply that readers or viewers get to see your work. And yet the change in patterns of consumption has changed the job in important ways. The pressure is on to create stories that are easily shared and that have important key words in the headlines. So the witty headline with a pun in it, which was the pride and joy of The Economist, is no longer welcomed online. What you want instead is something that attracts search engines, and so in my world that involves keywords like Trump or Brexit. Unfortunately, knowing the popular words also means knowing the unpopular words, and that includes things like Syria, because knowing more about who your audience is and what it wants inevitably affects the kind of things that journalists report on, and perhaps most important, that editors commission. The threat for foreign reporters is that the rise of the internet and social media not only makes it harder to fund foreign bureaus, but it also increases the pace that foreign news gets marginalized. Now that editors can count every click, they can see that most foreign news is not very popular with readers. I know, for example, that if I write a column about Syria, it will usually get relatively few readers, particularly if it's analysis, which is necessarily complicated. Syria, I think, is the most important international story of the moment, but readers find it depressing, they find it confusing, and it's all a long way away. By contrast, as I said, I know that if I put Donald Trump or Brexit in the headline, I'm much more likely to find my column in the list of most read stories. And of course, that is an incentive. It's an incentive for me, it's an incentive for editors. And even Donald Trump or Brexit probably don't really count as foreign news, because the fact is that most of the FT's readers are in the US or in Britain, so they're consuming stuff that feels directly relevant to them. Now, in a normal business, that wouldn't be a dilemma. You give the customers more of what they want, and you take the unpopular items, like stories about Syria, off the shelves. But in a business like journalism, which also plays a vital role in the creation of a healthy democratic society, it's not that simple. The media do play a civic role, and I think we have a duty to try to inform the country. As James Cameron wrote in Point of Departure, the reporter engaged in serious affairs must be the people's eyes and ears. He must be the instrument associating people's government with people's opinion. And the fact is that Britain as a country and as a democracy cannot simply afford to ignore the outside world. In recent years, we've got involved in wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. We're just embarking on a complex and fraught negotiation involving 27 other members of the EU. Informed public debate about the choices facing Britain requires information, and I think crucially, when it comes to Brexit, it requires information about what people on the other side of the channel are thinking, how they are likely to respond to the kind of things that we put forward as regard as perfectly reasonable. Because if there are, and I suspect there are, unpleasant surprises waiting in the Brexit negotiations, they come precisely from the lack of an understanding of how these arguments are seen in Brussels or Berlin or Paris. And that is the role of the foreign correspondent, to provide that information. You can't guarantee how it will be used, but you have to provide it. And that job cannot simply be left to publicly funded media, such as the BBC, because the diversity of views and voices is important. Not just of ideological views, but just different people digging away at different things. Unfortunately, the injunction to keep reporting on foreign news, even if interest levels are low, can sound a bit like a schoolteacher insisting that children must continue to be served cabbage, even if they hate cabbage and push it to the side of the plate. However, The rise of the internet and social media also has a positive side for those of us attempting to cover the world. While we now know that the general audience for foreign news is relatively small, social media also allows for the creation of lots of small niche audiences. So while in the old days, and I'm talking actually only about a decade ago or less, a story, say on Sri Lanka, that appeared in the FT might get a few thousand readers in the newspaper, maybe fewer. Now it's likely to be shared via social media amongst a whole community of Sri Lanka watchers, probably mainly expatriates, but also academics, one-time tourists, business people, human rights organizations, and the like. So social media allows you to find your reader and your readers to find you. And your audience can also, and is, increasingly global. And that's already changed the business model of many British newspapers. The FT and The Economist discovered the American audience a long time ago, and now both The Guardian and the Daily Mail have built up substantial audiences in the US. The rise of social media has also blurred the distinction between consumers and producers of news in interesting ways. One of the niche issues that I follow particularly closely is the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. These are covered pretty sporadically in the British press. Until a couple of years ago, trying to follow what was going on would have involved reminding myself to log on occasionally to the websites of papers like the Straits Times or the South China Morning Post. And before that, it would have actually involved going to my newspaper's library, reading copies of those papers that had probably arrived a few days late. Now I can follow the Twitter feeds of fellow South China Sea watchers, and every day I'll see the thoughts and articles and snippets of news posted by researchers or journalists in Sydney or Singapore or Hawaii, and they're helping to improve my work, and I hope occasionally I'm helping to improve theirs. And I can also exchange ideas with these people and commission articles if I want. Of course, exactly who these people on the Twitter feeds are can be a bit mysterious. So as the saying goes, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. There's a New Yorker cartoon, actually, of a dog typing away. And so to take my South China Sea example, one of the Twitter feeds I follow is called 9-Line, which is a reference to the line that China draws on maps of that sea to delineate its maritime claims. A few weeks ago, I got a direct message from 9-Line. So I replied, and I took the opportunity to say, by the way, who are you and where are you based? To which I got the reply, oh, we're just a group of people who take an interest in this issue, which really raised more questions than it answered. The whole question of authorship and origins is in fact increasingly hard to pin down in the age of social media. A story can go viral and be all over the internet, and yet it can be surprisingly hard to identify how the story got reported or whether it's even true. A good example of the problems this poses was provided for me by a friend who does PR for a big Middle Eastern government. A story had gone viral about a sex scandal reportedly involving a member of the royal family of this aforesaid country that my PR friend was being well paid to represent. So he set about doing his job, which was to try to challenge and quash the story. But the techniques he would have used in the past, which is ring the editor of the newspaper involved, demand a retraction, or a follow-up story quoting your client, simply didn't apply in this case, because this particular salacious story had now been shared all over the social media, and the sources of the story were very obscure. It appeared after some investigation to have first seen the light of day on a little-known Middle Eastern news website, which didn't answer the phone or respond to emails. In any case, the story was now out there and being disseminated on Facebook, Twitter, and the like. So even if a retraction could be secured, there was little reason to suppose that any of the consumers of the original story would ever see it. So my friend concluded the story had probably been made up and planted by a political enemy of the individuals involved, or perhaps by an intelligence agency in a rival country. He never really got to the bottom of it. And that brings me to the final topic I'd like to deal with tonight, which is the way that Western narratives about world events are increasingly under challenge. Now, on the face of it, that should not be a cause for alarm. Every country and reporter brings their own biases and interests to a story, so it should be a good thing if we now get more perspectives from non-Western sources. The difficulty is that much of the non-Western reporting on an issue such as Syria seems to be being produced not by independent reporters, but by fronts for governments that want to get particular agendas across. I'm talking most obviously about Russia Today, or RT, and the counter-narrative that it promotes about crucial stories, such as who shot down that Malaysian airliner over Ukraine, or who bombed the humanitarian convoy going into Aleppo. For most of the Western media or the reporters I know who dug into those stories, the answer in both cases seemed pretty clear-cut. It was probably the Russian Air Force in Aleppo, and it was a Russian-backed militia in Ukraine. A recent exhaustive Dutch report on the downing of MH17 over Ukraine has certainly concluded that the crime was carried out by a pro-Moscow militia using a surface-to-air missile supplied by the Russians. But if you follow social media, listen to radio phone-ins in Britain, or just look at the comments beneath articles in the FT and other papers, and where those comments are coming from is another interesting question, you can see that this explanation is widely disbelieved even in the West. Counter-stories put out by the Russians that it was actually a Ukrainian missile that shot down the plane, or even that the whole MH17 thing was a hoax, that the plane was stuffed with corpses and then deliberately crashed, are widely believed. Now, this is not actually an entirely new phenomenon. I was recently reading a biography of George Orwell, and his fear of government-sponsored falsehood, reflected in 1984 with a sinister-sounding and Ministry of Truth, Orwell began to worry about that, particularly when he fought in the Spanish Civil War. And Orwell fought with the Spanish anarchists, and he was appalled by the way that the anarchists were smeared as fascist sympathizers by false stories put out, as it happens, by the Russians and the Spanish communists, who were in turn widely believed by Russia's sympathizers in the West. So those parallels between the Spanish Civil War and the Syrian conflict today are interesting in this respect and in others. However, the ability for the Russians and others to create counter-narratives and to, as Bob Dylan, the new Nobel laureate, put it, cover up the truth in lies, has now been greatly amplified by the rise of social media. And of course, Western governments and the Western media have to be honest with ourselves. The credibility of the stuff put out by RT and the lack of belief in some of the stuff that we put out partly reflects the fact that they've got better and we've got worse. So the whole debacle of the Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction that never were has rightly made consumers of news much more skeptical. The British and American governments promoted a story about Iraq's WMD, knowingly or unknowingly, that turned out to be false, and much of the Western media was too credulous and uncritical in reporting those claims. If readers and viewers are now more skeptical, we shouldn't be that surprised. And RT and CCTV, the Chinese equivalent, are also now more sophisticated than, say, Radio Moscow or Radio Beijing ever were in the Cold War. They are often happy to invite Western commentators, such as myself, on. In Beijing recently, I did a live 30-minute discussion on CCTV about the US elections on their English language channel, and it was a little bit angled, but it wasn't obviously appalling. I'm also quite often invited to appear on RT, although I tend not to accept those invitations. So if this is propaganda, it's sophisticated propaganda, relatively sophisticated propaganda, where the aim is frequently not to block Western viewpoints, but simply to confuse the narrative, to provide a counter-narrative. Now again, if this was simply a battle of ideas or ideologies, I wouldn't really object to it. Debate's fine. What worries me is the growing evidence of Russian attempts to deliberately plant false or manufactured stories in the Western media. Then the stories often start on RT, and then which has a relatively small audience, but then they're disseminated via social media. And the idea is not necessarily to supplant the version of events being put out in the West, it's to confuse the picture. So the idea is neatly summarized in the title of a book put out by Peter Pomerantsev, or written by Peter Pomerantsev, and his title is Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. And I should note that Pomerantsev worked for many years in Russian television, so is well aware of the whole modus operandi. The Russians are the most sophisticated in playing this game, but others are catching up. So on my recent trip to Beijing, I had dinner with a member of the Chinese government, and we discussed the RT phenomenon and CCTV's own efforts to go global. For those of you looking for jobs, they're planning to greatly expand their presence in London over the next year. During the conversation, I mentioned a description that I'd heard, and this was by another lecturer. I can't absolutely vouch for its truth, but it was an interesting description of how the Russians allegedly produced their counter-narratives. This is by a guy who claimed to have worked in the actual manufacture of false stories, and said that one department is charged with producing the false stories, another is then charged with disseminating them across social media in the West. And as I put forward this description, I glanced across the table at the assistant of my Chinese host, who slightly disconcertingly was scribbling furiously and taking extensive notes on how this is done. And one of my worries is that as privately funded Western media cuts back on its coverage of the world, so non-Western media, often quite lavishly funded by governments, such as Russia, Qatar, China, is expanding. Now, as I say, on one level, a contest of ideas and a plethora of voices is to be welcomed, but when that shades into deliberate and well-funded efforts to distort the truth, we do need to worry. And I was discussing this because I'm aware, what I'm saying about RT is not necessarily universally accepted with a colleague of mine who covers Russia on the way here. And I said, you watch this more often than I do. Can you give me an example of the kind of thing they put out? And one he put out was that RT was, for some time, there was a gas attack in Syria, which had been covered by a BBC television crew. And RT put out a story saying that this was manufactured, that all the footage had been made up. Now, call me naive, but I used to work at the BBC. I know they don't do that sort of stuff. And in a sense, this is what I suppose a psychologist might call transference. They were accusing the BBC of doing something that they themselves were actually doing. When I first started reporting foreign news in the mid-1980s, it was still possible to aspire to do that job in a way that was very similar to the way that James Cameron had done it 30 years earlier. But 30 years further on, in 2016, the nature of the job has changed enormously. Technology has been transformed, the audience has changed, and so is the way it consumes news. And the balance of power and wealth in the global economy has also shifted, and all of that's changing the international media scene fast. But I do think one thing about the nature of the job hasn't changed since the days of James Cameron. There'll always be a need and an appetite for world news. That appetite will vary. There'll be periods when people aren't that interested in a particular story that you think is important. But there will be periods when they are very much aware that they need to be informed, whether that is the run-up to something like the Iraq War, whether it's the Brexit negotiations. And at that point, the need for a group of people who have expertise, who know how to operate in foreign countries, who know how to assimilate information and then package it in a way that is both compelling but also that explains it in a way that makes sense to a domestic audience. At that point, the foreign correspondent absolutely comes into their own. There will always be an appetite for world news, and traveling the world as a reporter will remain one of the most exciting and rewarding jobs in journalism, or indeed in any profession that I can think of. And for all the confusion and competition, I do remain confident that proper, well-reported stories will ultimately find a bigger audience than weak or plain false reporting. The best journalism of the kind practiced by James Cameron will always find an audience. Thank you very much.